Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
He stood there with that lazy grin he always wears when he knows the room tilts in his favor and said, in that joking voice he uses whenever he has done something that would get anyone else grounded into the floor, that my parents would never let me be mad at him. And while the words sounded like a tease, they came with a certainty that knocked the air out of me because he was not wrong. He had wrecked my laptop in a way that was not an accident, not a fluke, not a spilled mug or a clumsy elbow, but a reckless show-off moment with a drink in one hand and a video playing too loud in the other, while he leaned across the table to prove he knew more about tech than I did and yanked the charger at an angle that cracked the port and the board. And when the screen blinked and died and the smell of fried parts hit me, he laughed like we were on a sitcom and I was the uptight character who needed to loosen up. I wish I could tell you I yelled, that I threw his words back at him and told him to pack up and get out, but the truth is I felt that old family gravity kick in, the one where my mom says keep the peace and my dad gives that exhausted look that means do not make a scene. And before I could even say this is my work, this is my livelihood, my mother was soothing him, telling him accidents happen, and my father was already offering to look into repair shops, and my cousin Chris, who has coasted on this family's forgiveness since we were kids, shrugged and said he would help me set up a temporary solution on my old backup machine if I could find it, like he had just donated a kidney. I kept hearing his line in my head, that thing about my parents not letting me be mad, and it was not just a taunt, it was a history lesson, because he has always been the one who gets the soft landing, the one who loses keys, misses deadlines, borrows and forgets to return, and somehow becomes the person everyone wants to protect, and I become the one who is supposed to be the bigger person, the reasonable one, the fixer, the absorber of chaos, and I could feel myself slipping into that role. Again, while my stomach burned and my hands shook, and I kept thinking about how much of my life, my clients, my archive, my projects, were in that machine, and how quickly he had turned my panic into a joke we were all expected to laugh at. So I did what I do when I know I am outnumbered in the moment. I went quiet, I nodded, I let the conversation drift to repairs and backups and a plan to circle back next week. And while my parents fussed over Chris like he was the one who needed comforting, I excused myself, took my phone, sat on the edge of my bed, and opened my email to search for something I had not thought about in months. Something small that had seemed annoying at the time, but not worth a fight, a confirmation from my bank that I had taken a hit for him once before, a transfer that moved out of my account and into his after he used my phone, just for a second, to check a score and somehow managed to send himself money through a saved contact and then swear he had no idea how it happened. Back then I had told myself it was easier to eat the charge than drag the family into a debate about digital mistakes and personal responsibility. And I closed the door on it because I was tired and it was the holidays and I did not want to be the person who turns a gathering into a tribunal. But that night, with my laptop dead and his smirk still on my skin, I typed in the keywords I remembered, the bank name and the word transfer and his first and last name, and up popped the message I half expected never to find. A clean little receipt with the time and the routing details and his account name sitting there like it had been waiting for me to grow a spine. I read it once, then again, and while I read it my breathing slowed and the urge to cry settled into something colder and steadier, because this was not about vengeance for some petty slight. This was about a pattern that ate my patience one bite at a time. And I realized he had been right that my parents would try to manage my anger out of existence, but he was wrong about me not having options, because I had proof, and proof does not care about a golden boy story or a charming laugh or the cousin card that gets flashed whenever he is cornered. I forwarded the email to a folder I keep for tax records and disputes, and then I sent it to myself at another address too, because I am done with files that vanish when someone else is holding the power cord. And when I came back to the living room, I had that calm I get when I know I am holding something sharp and silent. And I told Chris that since he felt bad he could at least help me by logging into my old backup machine so I could pull a few files and send invoices on time, and he swaggered over like a hero, only to discover that the ancient thing would not boot without patience and focus, which he does not have, and while he fumbled, I opened a payment request on my phone and typed out a clear note that said replacement for the laptop you destroyed today. Then I sent it, not just to him but to the family group where he preens the loudest, because if there is one thing I have learned it is that people who rely on whispers hate receipts that talk. He looked at his phone, glanced up at me, then at my parents, who were caught between scolding me and pretending not to see. And I kept my voice easy and steady as I said that I was done arguing about accidents and intentions, and that I expected full replacement, not a patch job and not store credit in the form of favors he would never deliver, and that I wanted it handled before the week turned. And while he tried to make another joke, I watched it wither, because the group chat pinged with two cousins asking if everything was okay, and my aunt asking what happened, and I smiled, the kind of smile you give when you have just shifted the weight of the room a few inches in your direction. That was not the big move, not even close, but it was the first real line I had drawn in years, and I could tell from the way Chris swallowed and changed the subject that he felt the edge under his feet, and I thought, go ahead, enjoy the spotlight while you can. Because this time I am not letting the story get rewritten, and the next time we talk about transfers, I will not be the one who has to explain a thing. If you have grown up in a family where one person is treated like a delicate favorite no matter how old he gets or how many messes he leaves behind, you know the routine, because it is not dramatic or even interesting from the outside. It is just this steady background rule that says keep things smooth and let him be himself, and by himself they mean the version of him that breaks things and shrugs and gets forgiven so fast he barely feels the heat, and I can list the greatest hits the way people list songs on a road trip, like the time he borrowed my external drive and returned it with half the folders gone because he thought they were duplicates, or the time he copied my presentation deck and pitched it to a friend as his own template to help them out. Or the time he asked to use my card for a small purchase because his tap would not work, and then 2 days later there was a charge I did not recognize that he swore was a glitch, which somehow became my bank's fault and not his. But the point is not the inventory of small thefts. The point is the way my parents would lean in with that soothing chorus that says he did not mean it. Let us all breathe. Do not make a federal case out of this. So when my laptop cooked itself under his carelessness and he tossed out that smug line about my parents not letting me get mad, what hurt was not only the broken machine, but the way he spoke the family rule out loud like a magic spell. Because saying the quiet thing out loud makes it real in a way you cannot unhear, and after I found that old transfer receipt and felt the calm of having proof, I did something that would sound petty if you have never been quiet for too long. I opened a notes app and started tracking dates and amounts I could remember, not for a revenge spreadsheet, at least not yet, but to stop gaslighting myself about the pattern, and as I wrote out the moments where I paid and he walked, I could see the shape of it. This slope we have all been sliding down while calling it family love. I knew if I confronted him too soon he would laugh and pivot, and my parents would rush in with that familiar mediation tone that turns truth into opinions and opinions into misunderstandings. So I made a different choice that felt both small and enormous. I went over my bank settings that night and turned on every alert. I added two-step verification everywhere. I changed passwords he might have glimpsed when he hovered over my shoulder, and then I called the bank and asked them to place a note on my account in plain language that said no transfers to this name without a call from me first, and hearing the representative read it back to me while I sat on the floor with my dead laptop next to me felt like a lock sliding into place. Not because a note can save a life, but because it meant I was not just waiting for the next blow. The next morning brought the kind of family theater I could have scripted in my sleep, with my mother calling to ask whether I had calmed down and my father offering to split the cost of repairs if I would not push Chris too hard because his schedule was stressful and he had a lot on his plate, and I kept my voice steady while I said I was not angry. I was practical and I needed a real replacement, not a patch, and I could hear my mother's disappointment that I was using corporate words like replacement and liability, and I let it sit because letting it sit is sometimes the only way to teach people you mean it, and when Chris finally texted me himself he wrapped his message in that phony charm he thinks reads as maturity. Something about wanting to make things right and could we meet halfway, which was his favorite phrase when he was trying to turn my loss into shared responsibility. I told him I would be sending an invoice with a due date by the end of the week, and before he could spin, I added that if he preferred to have everything transparent for the family, we could keep the conversation in the group thread. And the silence that followed tasted like a small, sharp victory, because people who count on side conversations do not like daylight, and while he typed and deleted, I forwarded myself the transfer receipt one more time and saved a copy in a separate cloud folder. Named after a project I knew he would never think to open, not because I am paranoid, but because I learned from my own mistakes and from his habits. While this was unfolding, my aunt texted the group to remind everyone about a small family dinner planned for the weekend to celebrate my grandmother's health milestone. And I watched Chris immediately jump in with a plan to give a little toast about gratitude and staying close, which sounded sweet if you did not know him, but to me read like a preemptive charm offensive to set the tone before the laptop conversation resurfaced. And I felt that prickle that says the stage is being set whether you help or not, so you might as well choose your lines. I spent that afternoon backing up client files from my phone and the coughing backup machine. I called one of my clients to explain the delay without dragging family drama into it, and I could hear my own voice sounding older in a good way. Like I no longer needed permission to be the adult in the room, and when I hung up I decided to do one more thing that would not seem like revenge to anyone outside the situation, but felt like reclaiming oxygen. I drafted a short, plain message to the group, listing the replacement cost, the model, the reason a patch would not work, and the date I expected repayment, and I ended it with a simple line that said, "I appreciate prompt resolution, so we can all focus on celebrating this weekend." Which was not a threat and not a plea, it was just a boundary wearing a tie. The responses trickled in, a few cousins sending thumbs-up words and one aunt saying she hoped we could all move on quickly for Nana's sake, and Chris wrote that he would bring cash to the dinner. Which I did not believe for a second because cash is how he buys time and later claims he forgot the envelope. So I replied that a transfer the day before would be ideal and that I would send the details in a private message, and then, because timing is everything and momentum matters, I sent him those details along with a screenshot of the old transfer receipt that clearly showed his name and the date and the amount he pretended not to remember. And I watched the typing bubbles appear and vanish until he finally wrote that he had no idea what I was talking about and that this looked like some kind of mix-up. And I said we can clear up any mix-up at dinner if needed. I will bring the receipt. And that was the point where I felt the ground tilt toward me, not all the way, not yet, but enough to know that the old script had a tear in it, because for the first time he was not swaggering, he was stalling, and I did not push. I just let the silence grow on his side of the screen while I took a deep breath and imagined him searching his memory for what I might have, which was exactly where I wanted him to be when the weekend came and the room filled with relatives who have always admired his speech is about gratitude, because there is nothing like a stage he built for himself when you are ready to tell a different story. And if you think sending that screenshot was petty, wait until you hear what I put in my bag right after. Because I was not coming with only a phone. There is a kind of calm that shows up only after you decide you are done begging people to understand the obvious, and that is the calm I carried into the next few days. Because I understood that if I let myself explode in a hallway argument or a text storm, then everything would slip back into the family script where I am emotional and he is misunderstood. So I chose a different lane where I sounded reasonable, moved deliberately, and made a paper trail thick enough that no one could pretend not to see it, and the first step was simple and boring in a way that makes people underestimate it. I took the dead machine to a real shop and asked for a written assessment that explained the kind of damage it had and the likely cause. And when the technician wrote it in plain language that even my most performative cousin could read without squinting, I thanked him and asked him to put the serial number and the estimate on the page, which he did without drama, and I walked out with a document that did not scream or accuse, it just spoke. I went home and did the part no one claps for, which was sorting out my work life with the coughing backup machine and a borrowed keyboard, and while I was doing that I kept my tone in the family thread light and normal. Not to pacify anyone, but to lull them into thinking I had swallowed the usual pill, and when my mother called to say we should keep Saturday gentle for Nana's sake, I told her I agreed, and that was why I wanted this handled before then. Because nothing ruins a celebration like unpaid damage hanging in the air, and I could hear the pause where she decided whether to argue or retreat, and she picked retreat, which told me I was finally speaking in a language that sounded like adulthood to her rather than defiance. I sent Chris a clean, professional invoice with the replacement cost and the due date written in words, not because I expected him to read carefully, but because I wanted his excuses to trip over the detail. And I attached the assessment from the shop with a short note that said this helps your records and mine, which was the kind of line he hates because it makes him feel like a person who has records, and he replied with that smirking tone even in text. Something about appreciating my thoroughness and wanting to work something out, and then he suggested a store gift card from a place he gets points at, and I wrote back that I would accept a direct transfer only. And I ended the message with a line that said thanks in advance for taking responsibility, which was not sarcasm, it was a verbal lock. While he stalled, I made small moves that would not look like moves to anyone who does not live in this kind of family. I asked my cousin Leah, the only person who sees through him without making a speech about it, to bring the little projector she uses for holiday photo slideshows to the dinner, and I framed it as a sweet idea, something fun for Nana, a collage of old pictures, which was true because I scanned a handful of photos that would make her smile. But it also gave me the option to cast from my phone without asking anyone to pass a cable, and I am not pretending that was an accident. It was a stage light quietly aimed at a wall in case I needed one. I also did one thing that still makes me proud because it pushed back against the laziest part of my nature. I sat down and wrote a timeline for myself, a plain list of what happened, when, what I said, what he said, what proof I have, and who read it. And I printed it with the bank receipt clipped behind it and the shop assessment tucked after that, and I slid the stack into a plain manila envelope with his name written on the tab in my neatest handwriting, not to be dramatic but to keep me from ad-libbing when the room got loud, because nothing kills clarity like adrenaline, and he counts on adrenaline. Late that afternoon, after I sent the invoice, I got a two-step verification ping from my bank asking to confirm a login attempt from a device I did not recognize, and I stared at it until it timed out because I had no intention of approving anything. And then I opened the security page and saw the timestamp matched the exact window between his last text and the group message where he posted a lazy joke about me overreacting to electronics, which was the kind of coincidence that makes your stomach go cold even as your brain says do not jump to conclusions, and I did not. I just took a screenshot of the alert and saved it next to the receipt in a folder called Saturday, because I prefer facts to impressions and patterns to hunches. But I am not blind to rhythm, and his rhythm has always been try something and then deny it before the echo fades. He must have felt the sand shifting because he sent a private message a little later that tried for brotherly concern and clanged like a lid on a cheap pot, saying he hoped I would not bring negativity to Nana's celebration, that he was trying to do the right thing here, and that he would be happy to help me choose a laptop if I would agree we were square, and I read it twice, and then typed one line that said I am bringing gratitude and truth, see you Saturday, which is the kind of sentence that makes a man like him nervous because it does not open doors for spin, and I could almost hear him pacing his living room, trying to decide whether to apologize or attack. To keep myself from second-guessing, I called my bank and asked them to note the attempted login, and I asked a practical question about reversals and records. Not because I wanted to nuke his life, but because I wanted to know exactly which levers existed if he pushed me, and when the representative told me what documentation they would need for any formal dispute, I checked each item against the folder I had built and felt that rare satisfaction of realizing I was not improvising. I was prepared, and there is a huge difference between those two states when you face a person who thrives on chaos. That evening the family thread lit up with plans for who would bring what dish and who would pick up Nana, and then Chris added a flourish about wanting to make a short toast about responsibility and gratitude, which would have charmed me when we were teenagers and he could still sell sincerity on credit, but now it just sounded like a man trying to build a cushion to land on, and I replied with a little heart word for Nana and nothing for him. And then I set an alarm on my phone for a time. That lined up with dessert, because that is when people listen with their guard down, and I packed my bag with the envelope, a spare cable, a portable battery, and a calm I had earned, and as I zipped it shut I got one last ping. A payment request cancellation notice from him for a tiny amount he had sent that morning marked good faith, which he had just withdrawn with the note, misunderstanding, and I laughed without humor because it told me everything about his plan. So I sent him one final message, not angry and not pleading, just a single sentence that said bring your gratitude and bring your memory, because I will bring mine, and I put my phone face down and let the silence sit. And if you are wondering whether that was the revenge, it was not. It was only the rehearsal, because the thing I had in my bag was not just paper, it was a way to make the room hear the part he always talks over. And when he raised his glass on Saturday and looked for his spotlight, I was ready to dim it with one tap. The thing about family gatherings that no one admits out loud is that they are less about food and more about choreography, with everyone taking the places they always take and saying the lines they always say. So when I walked into my aunt's house with a calm voice and a plain bag that held my envelope and the tiny projector my cousin Leah had slipped me, I already knew where the pressure points would be and who would try to manage them. And I decided before I hung up my coat that I was not going to be baited into being the problem while the actual problem passed out compliments and acted generous, because I have played that role for years and all it ever gets me is the kind of apology that evaporates before the coffee cools. Nana was the center of the evening in the way she should have been, with relatives doing that polite shuffle around her chair and asking careful questions about doctors and schedules and how she was feeling. And I made sure to keep my voice bright and my answers about work and life simple, because this moment was about her and about keeping the tone warm until it mattered. And when my mother squeezed my hand with that plea that says, "Let tonight be peaceful," I said the words she needed to hear, which were that I was happy to be there and wanted to keep it all easy. And I meant it in the way a person means it when she is holding back a heavy door until the right time to open it. Chris arrived with that on-cue energy he always brings to rooms full of people who like him best in small doses, and he made a loud show of greeting Nana and asking if he could get her anything, which would have been sweet if it did not come packaged with that constant awareness of his own performance, and when he made his way to me he held out a small envelope as if it were a grand gesture. And he said in a voice I am sure he practiced that he wanted to take a step toward making things right. And I took the envelope and felt that it was too light to be real, and I said thank you and tucked it into my bag without opening it, because I had no interest in being part of a scene where he gets public credit for private nonsense. And he looked briefly thrown that I did not do the dance of counting and declaring it generous. My father sidled up and asked if we could keep any financial talk for another time, and I told him, with a tone I borrowed from every manager who ever taught me how to hold a line, that the best way to protect Nana's evening was to have nothing unresolved, and that I planned to keep it brief and factual if it came up at all, and he gave me that look that says he is disappointed in me for being so firm, as if firmness were worse than the breaking and borrowing that got us here, and I let the look pass through me without catching, because I am done collecting other people's discomfort like souvenirs. Dinner moved the way these dinners move, with stories that have been told 100 times and small jokes that make the quieter cousins laugh in relief, and I stayed present enough to honor Nana and distant enough to keep my mind clear. And when dessert plates came out and someone brought up the plan for a little slideshow, Leah caught my eye and nodded, and I took my phone out with the same casualness I would use to check a message, and I connected it to the projector without announcing it, because there is nothing showy about a plug clicking into place. Chris, who cannot resist a microphone even when the microphone is imaginary, stood and tapped a glass and said he wanted to share a few words about responsibility and gratitude, and several relatives actually clapped, which would have made me laugh if I were not so focused on not missing my moment, and he began his toast with a practiced rhythm, talking about how family holds us up and how we should aim to be there for each other in ways that matter rather than keeping score. And while he spoke, he glanced at me in that sideways way that says he thinks he has placed me back on my mark, the cooperative cousin who will swallow the slight for the sake of the group, and I smiled at Nana and let him keep going, because every extra sentence he stacked on that speech was a rung on a ladder he would not want to fall from. He finished with a flourish about owning our mistakes and making amends, a line I am sure sounded noble to everyone who has never been on the receiving end of his selective amnesia. And people murmured their approval because the words were the right shape even if the reality behind them was hollow, and he started to sit down, prepared to bask in the kind of glow that feeds him for days. And I rose only enough to be heard and said I would like to add one short note of gratitude, and the room turned toward me the way rooms do when a woman who rarely asks for the floor finally does, and I held their attention with something I learned from every meeting that went sideways in my career, which is that calm is a scalpel when panic is a hammer. I said I was grateful for a family that values clarity, because clarity prevents resentments from festering and stories from twisting, and I said I was grateful for Nana teaching me that honesty is only real when it costs a little. And I kept my voice even and plain, the same tone I used when I told clients about timelines and scope, and then I said that since we are celebrating responsibility and gratitude, I wanted to thank Chris for agreeing to make full restitution for the laptop he damaged, and for confirming that transfers between family members should always be transparent, and I tapped my phone and the wall filled with a simple document that needed no commentary, a bank transfer confirmation bearing his full name, the date, the amount, and the little description field he had typed with his usual carelessness, and the room made the sound that rooms make when oxygen changes. My mother started to speak and my father reached for my elbow and Chris laughed too loudly in that way people laugh when they are buying time. But there is a difference between words and paper, and everyone in that room has lived long enough to know that difference. So I let the silence work as hard as my mouth had worked all week, and I said, still polite, that in the spirit of all the noble things we just heard, I would appreciate it if the balance on the replacement could be settled now, and if there was any confusion about past transfers, we could clear them as a family so Nana would not have to wonder whether this was one more story that would turn fuzzy by morning. And I held his eye because I wanted him to understand that this had nothing to do with anger anymore and everything to do with leverage, and his smile slipped the way a loose handle comes off in your hand, and he reached for his envelope as if it could save him, which is when I said, gently and clearly, that I had not opened it yet because I preferred verified transfers, and that if he wanted to make a statement about responsibility, the bank app was the simplest stage. He started to explain, and my aunt tried to pivot to another topic, and my father muttered my name like a warning, but Nana, who has survived enough storms to know when to pick her moment, said in a voice that shut down the noise that she liked clarity too, and that if there were receipts to be seen we might as well see them, and Chris's face did a calculation I have watched since we were kids, that quick scan for exits and allies. And finding neither, he defaulted to bluster, which is exactly what I wanted, because bluster collapses under paper, and I tapped my phone again to bring up the repair assessment with the technician's plain description that matched the story I had told from day one, and I said I would keep it short if he would. And I asked a single question that landed like a pin on a quiet table, which was whether he preferred to use the same account he used last winter for the transfer, and then I stopped talking and waited for the answer. There is a moment in every family debate where the noise burns itself out and the only thing left is the question you knew you would have to ask, and I held us there without rushing, because I wanted him to feel the difference between the old rhythm where he tap dances and the new one where he answers, and when he tried to shrug and say he did not remember any transfer last winter and that maybe I was mixing up dates, I let the slide on the wall hold steady and I said that forgetting is not the same thing as not doing, and that I was happy to help his memory along by reading the little memo line he had typed, which was a sloppy joke that sounded very different in a quiet room with my grandmother watching. And I could see him calculating whether denial or charm would work faster, so I gave him a third option that cut both off at the knees by opening my banking app and mirroring my screen to the wall with the same calm I would use to show a client a project dashboard. And I said we can stop arguing about tone and talk about actions, because here is the invoice for the replacement, here is the routing, here is the due date, and here is a second line item marked repayment for the winter transfer you said was a glitch. And then I took my finger off the glass and let the silence do its job. He blurted out the word misunderstanding like it was a safety word he could wave around until the grown-ups rushed in to pat his head, and my mother tried to say we were all a bit heated and this could be sorted privately. And my father asked if I really needed to do this here, and I said kindly that I would love nothing more than to never talk about this again. And the fastest way to make that happen was to complete the transfer now while the whole family, who values responsibility and gratitude, was still gathered, and I turned the phone so he could see the request sitting right there with his name spelled out, and the little toggle that would let him split or edit grayed out because I had locked the fields with the estimate and the assessment attached, which meant he could not nickel and dime the damage into something smaller, and his breathing changed in that small way that tells you a person is remembering there are limits to the old tricks. He reached for the envelope he had tried to hand me earlier and said that cash would be simpler and cleaner, which would have been funny if I were not so tired of hearing that line. And I said cash is simple when you plan to claim later that you paid more than you did or that the rest got lost, and I am done with the kind of simplicity that keeps only him comfortable, and I added that if he wanted to show good faith he could pull out his phone, open the same app one was using, and join me in the grown-up world where a record exists, and he stared at me with that old dare in his eyes until Nana said, in that plain voice she uses when she wants everyone to stop acting like fools, that she would like to see this settled before the cheesecake goes stale. And I watched something in him give up the performance, because there are very few stages where a man like him will test a grandmother's patience on purpose. He pulled out his phone with a dramatic sigh that was meant to make me look petty and him look put upon, and while he tapped and scrolled I said, as gently as I could while still telling the truth, that if he ran into any trouble accessing his account I could share a screenshot of the security alert I received the other afternoon. The one that showed an attempted login to my bank from a device that popped up right after he had messaged me about wanting to resolve things like adults and the way his thumb froze told me I did not need to explain the timestamp, and I added that I had no interest in filing any formal report if this was resolved in full now, with a simple acknowledgement in the family thread so there would be no later confusion about who paid what and why, and I left it there because I did not need to press. I only needed to make sure he understood that I was not bluffing and that my preparation had real teeth. He finally moved through the screens, and when he reached the part that asked him to confirm the total he muttered that the laptop I chose was expensive, and I said calmly that the model listed on the assessment matched the work I do and the specs I lost, and that he does not get to downgrade my tools to make his mistake cheaper, and he stared at the number for a long time and then hit confirm on the first line. And I watched the pending notice pop up on my screen, which I let the room see, without commentary. And he hesitated on the second line marked repayment for the winter transfer, and he actually tried to say that bringing up old history was not fair, and I said fairness is a word I am happy to discuss after restitution, and Nana, bless her relentless sense, said pay the girl for what you took and then we can talk about feelings, and he looked at her and then at me and then at the wall where his own name sat next to the word confirm, and he pressed it like a man walking through a door he should never have opened in the first place. The notification chimed and the line changed from pending to processing and then to completed, and the only sound after that was the odd fork on a plate and my aunt clearing her throat, and I said thank you like a person takes a receipt at a counter. And I added that I would send a short note to the family thread summarizing that the damage and the winter transfer were resolved in full so no one would feel unsure tomorrow morning when stories start to blur, and his face did that drop I had imagined 100 times, not because he was broke or punished, but because the old machinery had failed him right in front of the audience that used to be his insulation. And there is a particular humiliation in discovering that your favorite magic trick does not work under real light. My mother tried to gather the night back into something soft, and my father patted Nana's hand and said he was glad we were all moving forward, and people shifted in their chairs and asked if anyone wanted coffee. And I closed the projection and put the phone away and left the envelope he had handed me on the table, still sealed, because I wanted him to sit with the knowledge that I did not need his props and I would not owe him a single thank you for the bare minimum. And when he mumbled that this felt harsh, I said it felt like clarity, and that I hoped he would remember the toast he gave about responsibility the next time he thought about borrowing anything that did not belong to him, including my patience. I hugged Nana and told her I loved her and that I was sorry the evening had a bump, and she squeezed my fingers and said bumps are better than lies that last for years, and I kissed her cheek and told my parents I was heading out. And when my mother whispered that she wished I had done it privately, I said I tried privacy for years, and it bought me silence and missing money, and I am done paying that price. And I walked to the door without rushing because this was not a victory lap, it was a reset, and resets do not need parades, they need consistency. And the only promise I made to myself on the drive home was that the folder called Saturday would stay in my cloud and that the next time someone told me to keep the peace, I would remember that peace is not the same thing as pretending. If you are asking whether it all smoothed out after that, I cannot give you a tidy answer, because families do not turn on a dime and people who have been allowed to skate for years do not turn into saints over one hard night. But I can tell you that the next time a cousin joked about me being intense, 2 others said she was right to ask for what she was owed. And I can tell you that my inbox the next morning had a new confirmation and not a single apology that asked for anything back, and I can tell you that when I opened my new machine and set my passwords and alerts exactly the way I wanted them, I felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was not victory fireworks or revenge confetti, just a clean, bright line that will be very hard for him to cross without tripping, and that is better than any speech, because it means that the next time he tries the smile and the joke about my parents, the only answer he will get is the one I gave him last night, which was not anger, or bitterness, or a scene. It was a receipt with his name on it and a room that finally believed what it saw.